Hey folks, David Stewart here. Pods and bugs, bugs and pods. And the big idea is that people usually can't conceive of a life or a future that is too far different from what they currently live in. So here's my big point here. Last year I wrote this little story called Live in the Pod and Eat Bugs because I kept seeing these stories pop up on if you want to live past 2050, be prepared to eat bugs. And the people that are choosing to live in pods and pod living, and this woman inspired by socialism who designed pods, which is basically like you rent a bunk with a curtain that you can close up that gives you your privacy, and otherwise you're basically living in a hostel, like a communal kind of environment. And people were very disturbed by this, and it's like, I'm never eating bugs, I'm not going to live in the pod, I can't believe they're suggesting this, our overlords are trying to shove us into little cattle pens and stuff. And the point I want to make here is the people who were thinking of this pod and bug stuff really weren't living too far away from that as it was. If you've not lived in the urban environment, or you don't know people who live in the dense urban environment, you don't realize that they're basically already living in pods. And in fact, the temptation of the pod is that it seems like a more utopian version of where they are already living. Maybe like one little step forward from where they are. They're already sharing an apartment with 10 other people because the apartment rent is like $4,500 a month. So they're already paying like $1,000 a month to share a room with other people. So they're like, well, for maybe I could save a little bit of money and just have a bunk. Right? Because it's so freaking expensive to live in the city. Now, I lived in LA and the LA area, technically in El Segundo, which is its own little town, but there's a bunch of little towns in LA. And we paid like $2,200 a month in rent, and we were pretty happy to pay that because other people were paying like $3,500 a month just right by us. But we were pretty close to the ocean. Other people really couldn't afford that, so they were stacking up in apartments. I split it with my wife, but it was like, there's apartments with 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 people in them. I had a good friend who lived in San Jose for a while and lived in a house with like 8 or 10 other people, and he was like, I had my own room, but other people were stacking themselves up like 4 to a room to try to save money because it was so expensive to live there. It cost so much money in rent. And of course, the guy who owned the house his mortgage was probably like $5,000 a month or something, maybe more, to try to just service the note on the house. Of course, he had to rent it out to a bunch of people just to be able to have a place for him to afford to live. If you haven't lived in those dense urban environments and had to stack up with like 4 other people, I knew people that were doing this in college days. Basically, they continued living in hostel and dorm room kind of environments to try to save money because it was so expensive to try to live in urban environments. If you live out in the rural environment, which I live in now, this seems like a bizarre dystopia, and it is. People are already living in that dystopia. It's a bizarre dystopia because you can buy a cheap apartment, or you can rent a room at a house for almost no money. You can buy a house and pay the mortgage on that house and have land to have a garden or keep some sheep or chickens or something. So if you live out in the country, the idea that someone would ever live in a tiny confined space surrounded by other people seems bizarre and disgusting. And indeed, I do find it very bizarre. But people choose to live in that environment. And my guess is that a lot of people in the urban environment have never really lived in the country and never really realized that there's places in the world that are cheap to live and have lots of space. They're like, I have to live in the city because I am a programmer, and so I must work at these tech firms, or I'm an engineer and I got to work at these tech firms, or I got to work in these engineering firms. Or they've just never left the city, or they think they like the amenities of the city. Meanwhile, the people that live in the city are working so hard they don't really have time to enjoy the amenities of the city. Usually it's the suburbanites who drive into the city to enjoy those. So anyway, you have this sort of problem here. Anyway, they're thinking just kind of one step past where they're already living. It's already very dystopian to live in the dense urban environment and have to be stacked up like sardines with other people and have to deal with their personal space issues and their noise making and things like that. The idea of having your own space and having privacy and peace and quiet is just alien to them. So the pod makes sense. It's an improvement over what they have. At least they have a curtain. They have their own space that they can close up, and it's cheap. That's the dream of the pod. Now, same thing with bugs. People who are living in the dense urban environment already eat garbage. They're either on 2 camps. Either they are, vegans, and so they're really into vegan stuff, which case Bugs, hey, we'll make the meat eaters eat bugs. They have no problem with that. They already view animal agriculture as, which they've probably never experienced it. In other words, they've never lived on a farm or seen what animal agriculture actually is, good or bad. But maybe they watched Food Inc. once, and that made them go vegan, even though they'd never seen a farm in their life. If you've ever watched Food Inc., it's a dastardly dishonest kind of movie about the food industry. Like most documentaries, it's really just propaganda for one political side. Not saying that like all animal agriculture is like very kind to the animals, but anyway, so I've never really seen that, but they're vegan. So of course, making those meat eaters eat bugs is no moral issue, and that doesn't disgust them because they might find bugs disgusting. Like, I just won't eat them. And I'll also say that there tends to be writers that write these bug articles that are from a particular religion which would never eat the bugs because of dietary restrictions, which makes the irony of telling people that they have to eat bugs all the more delicious. So people who are already eating bugs, they come in the vegan, or they are eating such processed garbage foods all the time in the urban environment. Eating bugs doesn't sound too far-fetched. They're eating stuff out of vending machines because they're so busy. They don't have time to have home-cooked meals. If they are at home, they're like throwing pre-made mini tacos into an oven, or like cooking some Tyson chicken nuggets in the microwave or something and eating before going to bed or going out to do something else. Or they're eating out all the time, eating fast food. They're basically already eating garbage in the urban environment. They're already eating things that are really not good for them and don't have a lot of substance and quality to them. And so it's just one more step to say, we'll eat bugs. In the urban environment, you can get fresh fruit. You can get all of that stuff, but a lot of people don't buy it because they're not, why would you buy a bunch of vegetables if you don't have time to even make a salad? Now you're going to buy the ho-hos out of the vending machine, on your break at work before you like stumble home to your pod to fall asleep. So it's really not that far-fetched for them to consider eating bugs. They already think animal agriculture is something bizarre and unsustainable with the earth. Meanwhile, I have chickens in my backyard. So I don't know. That's where a lot of these things come from. Now, same thing, we go like one step further with other things as well. You'll find most science fiction is just the current thing, trajectory continued. That's live in the pod and eat bugs, the satirical story I wrote, which I'll link down below. It's just things now, continuing forward. All of a sudden, it's satire, and people are like, "Man, you're like predicting the future with this story." I'm like, I didn't intend to. I was just writing a satire of like, if things were like this, but slightly worse. Haha! But it's just like that now. A year later, it's reality. So that's the problem with like future satire, is that it becomes just reality. It's like that. I think they had a Mad TV joke about the iPad, and it's like then they came out with the iPad. It's really funny how it's just continuing the thing forward in a science fiction setting will yield the future sometimes, good or bad. But people also have trouble conceiving of a substantively different life in a lot of other ways too. Just like how the urbanite bugman can't really think of a rural life where he has space to move and things are quiet and he doesn't have anything to do. His greatest fear of boredom. There's tons of stuff to do in the country. Tons of adventures I have with my kids that don't involve the internet. So just as he can't conceive of that, he can't really conceive of a life that is substantively different from the one he lives in other ways too, like owning a house or living apart from other people. Other people have this problem too. They can't think of what it means, like, oh, I'm gonna get rich by having a good paying job for a while. It's like, that's not really how you get rich by building businesses that have exponential growth in value and things like that. They can't really think of how rich people live their lives. Like, oh man, if I were rich, I would just live the current lifestyle I live, but maybe not go to work as much, right? It's like, oh, I'd stay home and do the same things that I do when I get home anyway, like watch Netflix and play video games. Like, that's what people think of usually when they're like, if I had $1 million, it's like, they're going to list the things that they do anyway. They just want to do more of them. They don't say, if I had $1 million, what I would do is I'd get a boat and do this, and I'd build a building over here that does this. Very few people are imaginative in that sense. Most people aren't that imaginative, and they just think of doing more of whatever they're doing. They can't really think of a life that's substantively different from the one that they have currently. And it's not me, maybe it sounds kind of me, I don't know, casting judgment on people. It's just people are not usually that imaginative. And so if something seems really shocking or dystopian, one of the things you have to keep in mind is those shocking statements aren't that shocking to the people making them. It's just one step forward from where they are currently at, either in their actual life or in their perception of reality. So when somebody is using really hyperbolic language in like a political context, that's only really one or two steps past what they are already thinking. And that's something that you have to keep in mind. People, even when they're being hyperbolic, are just continuing something forward on their current trajectory. They're not really being all that imaginative when it comes down to it. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. People are rarely that imaginative, and when they're writing science fiction, most things are just, and this includes what I do, it's current thing projected forward and not a whole lot of crazy imagination about how things are going to be different. But I love imagination. I'm a pretty imaginative person. I write a lot of books, so I'm probably a little bit more imaginative than most. But you'll find that most people are, a high degree of imagination for how society ought to be different is actually not really part of their thought process. They're mostly like piecemeal reformers thinking, well, I already share an apartment with 4 people. What if my bunk could close up and I could pay less money for that? Let's live in pods. It's an improvement. So anyway, guys, take it easy and I'll see you next time.